Why divorce papers?
There is a particular kind of strength that nobody talks about because it does not look like strength from the outside. It does not raise its voice. It does not break down in the middle of a hospital corridor or pound its fist on a kitchen counter or demand to be seen. It sits quietly in a driveway in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon with the worst news it has ever received folded in its lap, and it thinks, clearly, completely, without panic. The people who carry that kind of strength are the most dangerous people in any room they ever walk into, and the tragedy is that the people who most need to understand that almost never do. Derek Morgan spent 14 years living with that kind of strength across the breakfast table every single morning. He never once recognized it for what it was. That was the first mistake. Everything that followed was a consequence of that one failure to pay attention. She received her cancer diagnosis on a Monday morning in March of 2023. The doctor used careful words and a gentle voice, the practiced calm of a physician who has delivered this kind of news enough times to know that how it is delivered matters almost as much as what is said. Claire Morgan sat across from him in a paper gown and listened the way she listened to everything, completely and without interruption. She asked 3 questions when he finished. She wrote the answers down in the small notebook she kept in her purse. She thanked him. She scheduled her follow-up appointment at the front desk, and then she walked to her car in the parking garage of the medical building in Nashville, Tennessee, got into the driver's seat, and did not start the engine for 11 minutes. She did not call her husband. She did not call her best friend. She sat with the information, the way you sit with something you have been waiting a long time to arrive. Not with relief exactly, but with the recognition of a person who has prepared for a thing and is now simply watching it begin. When she finally drove home and pulled into the driveway of the house she had shared with Derek Morgan for 14 years, she did not go to the kitchen or the bedroom or the living room couch. She went to the home office at the end of the hallway, opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet beside her desk, and looked at the contents of that drawer for a long moment. Everything was exactly where she had left it. 3 years of careful, methodical, painstaking work, organized by date and category, and cross-referenced with the patience of a woman who had spent her entire professional career doing precisely this kind of work. She closed the drawer. She went to the kitchen, she put the kettle on, and she waited for her husband to come home, knowing already, with a certainty she had been carrying for months, that what was coming next would arrive faster than even she had planned for. 4 days later, on a Friday morning, Derek Morgan filed for divorce. He had the papers hand-delivered to the house that afternoon, while Claire was at her first consultation with her oncologist. She came home to find the envelope on the kitchen counter. She stood at that counter for a moment, read through the filing in the careful, methodical way she read through everything, set it back down, picked up her phone, and sent her attorney 4 words. He filed, "Your move." And then she put the phone in her pocket and went to check on the kettle because she had put it on again and forgotten about it, and that was simply the kind of detail that Claire Morgan did not let slip, even on days like this one. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a story like this one is even possible, you have to understand all of the people inside it. There was Claire Morgan, a woman her closest friend of 22 years, described as the calmest person she had ever known in a crisis, and the reason for that calm was something nobody outside of 2 people fully understood until the very end. There was Derek Morgan, her husband of 14 years, a regional vice president at a commercial real estate firm in Nashville, a man who was charming at industry events and controlled at home, and who had convinced himself, in the days between his wife's medical appointment and his attorney's advice to move quickly, that the timing of his divorce filing was his single greatest strategic advantage. There was Patricia Simmons, known to everyone as Pat, Claire's best friend, a retired school principal who had been carrying a secret for 3 years that she described afterward as the heaviest thing she had ever been asked to hold. There was Nathan Cross, Claire's attorney, a man with 20 years of high-asset divorce litigation behind him, who, when Claire first walked into his office, 18 months before any of this became public, and placed a large accordion folder on his desk, sat very still for a long time before he said anything at all. And there was Jessica Cole, the woman Derek Morgan had been conducting an affair with for nearly 2 years, who believed she was the reason for the divorce and had no idea that she was actually one of the smallest pieces of the real story. By the time everything in this story reached its conclusion, Derek Morgan would lose his assets, his position, his future plans, and his understanding of the person he had spent 14 years living beside without ever truly seeing. 3 questions sit at the center of everything that happened. What had Claire Morgan been quietly building inside her own marriage for 3 years without her husband's knowledge? Why did she not leave the moment she discovered what Derek had been doing? And when he filed those divorce papers on that Friday morning, believing it was his move, what door did he open that he could never, under any circumstances, close again? The answers to all 3 of those questions begin not with a courtroom or a confrontation or a dramatic moment of exposure. They begin with a filing cabinet in a home office in Nashville, Tennessee, and a woman who had learned a very long time ago that the only way to stay free is to know exactly where every dollar is. Claire Hargrove grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, the oldest of 3 children raised almost entirely by a single mother named Ruth, who worked 2 jobs for most of Claire's childhood and kept the family's finances in a small green ledger that she updated every Sunday evening at the kitchen table without fail. Ruth Hargrove was not a formally educated woman in the academic sense, but she understood money the way some people understand weather, instinctively and with a respect born from knowing what happens when you stop paying attention to it. She told Claire the same thing many times across many different years in many different ways, but the version that stayed with Claire the longest, the version she would carry into every room of her adult life, was this: the only way a woman stays free is if she knows exactly where every dollar is. Claire was 11 years old the first time she heard it. She never forgot it, not once. Not even when it would have been easier to let it go. Claire was a naturally gifted student in the way that children who grow up watching a parent manage difficulty tend to be focused, practical, and deeply suspicious of anything that did not add up on paper. She studied accounting and financial compliance at the University of Tennessee on a merit scholarship she had applied for 4 separate times before receiving it, and she graduated near the top of her class in 1994. The decade that followed was the decade in which Claire built herself into something formidable, though she would never have used that word to describe herself. She joined a mid-size insurance company in Nashville as a junior compliance analyst and worked her way steadily upward through a combination of precision and patience that her supervisors consistently noted in her reviews. She was the person in every department meeting who asked the question everyone else had been afraid to ask. She was the person who, when a set of numbers did not reconcile correctly, stayed until they did. She was, in the quiet and unglamorous language of financial compliance work, very good at finding the thing that someone did not want found. She met Derek Morgan at a professional networking event in the fall of 2007. He was 38 years old, already a senior associate at a commercial real estate firm, and he walked into a room the way men who are accustomed to being noticed tend to walk into rooms, as if the space had been waiting for them to arrive. Claire was 35. She had been focused on her career for long enough that the idea of a serious relationship had begun to feel like a thing she was building toward rather than a thing she was actively pursuing. Derek changed that, or at least he changed the pace of it. He was charming in a specific and targeted way, the kind of charming that makes a person feel genuinely seen. And for a woman who had spent most of her professional life being the most capable person in the room and one of the least acknowledged, that feeling was not a small thing. They dated for 2 years. They married in June of 2010 in a small ceremony in the Smoky Mountains with 40 guests and a reception that Derek insisted on upgrading twice. Claire paid close attention to the cost and said nothing about it, because she was in love with him, and because it was a wedding, and because she had not yet learned the particular way that Derek Morgan's financial instincts worked when left entirely unchecked. The early years of the marriage were good in the way that early years tend to be good when 2 people are still performing the best versions of themselves for each other. They had 2 children, a son named Ethan who arrived in 2011, and a daughter named Grace who came in 2013. Claire continued working through both pregnancies, taking the minimum leave each time, returning to her office still nursing, because she was Claire Morgan, and this was simply how she approached things. But Derek's career was accelerating in a way that required a level of social availability and household management that a two-income family with two small children struggled to provide, and in 2015, Derek raised the idea of Claire stepping back from full-time work. He framed it carefully, as he framed most things. The children needed more stability. The household would benefit from her presence. Her income was not irrelevant, but it was also not the larger of the two, and if they were thinking strategically about their family as a unit, the math supported the decision he was proposing. Claire sat with the conversation for 3 weeks. She asked questions, which was what she always did when she was uncertain. She made her own calculations, and in the end she agreed, because the math did support it, and because she trusted him. That trust, it would turn out, was the one area of her life where she had been insufficiently rigorous. She stepped back from formal full-time work in the spring of 2015. She managed the household, the children's schedules, the family's social obligations, and Derek's professional calendar with the same meticulous efficiency she had brought to every job she had ever held. She also, out of a professional habit so deeply ingrained she barely noticed she was doing it, continued to track the family's finances carefully. She reviewed the accounts monthly. She reconciled the statements. She knew where the money was, which mutual funds held what, which accounts were carrying what balances, which credit lines had been opened and when. It was not surveillance. It was simply how she had been raised to exist in relation to money. Derek knew she reviewed the finances and had never objected to it, perhaps because in the early years there was nothing there that required concealing, or perhaps because he had never genuinely considered that Claire's professional background made her capable of reading a financial statement the way most people read a roadmap, with an immediate and instinctive understanding of where things were heading and what it meant if they were going the wrong direction. The first irregularity appeared in the spring of 2019. It was small, the kind of small that a person without Claire's specific training might never have noticed or might have rationalized as a clerical error and moved on from without a second thought. An account transfer that did not correspond to any expense or investment activity she was aware of. A modest amount, moved to an account she did not recognize, from a joint account she reviewed regularly. She mentioned it to Derek casually over dinner that same week, framing it as a question rather than an accusation, the way you mention something that might be nothing, and probably is nothing but still needs an answer. Derek had an answer. It was plausible. It was the kind of answer that a person who was not paying close attention would have accepted without further thought. Claire accepted it in the room. She wrote it down when she got to her desk that evening, and she began watching. What she found over the following 8 months was not nothing. It was a pattern. Small transfers that had a shape to them, the shape of money being moved rather than spent, redirected rather than deployed. The accounts they were moving to were not familiar to her, which meant either they were new or they had been deliberately kept outside of her view, and the longer she looked, the more clear it became that the answer was the second one. By the time 2020 arrived, Claire had assembled enough information to understand 2 things with certainty. Derek had been moving marital assets into structures she had not been given access to, and the transfers had been happening long enough and in a pattern sophisticated enough that this was not carelessness or administrative confusion. It was a plan. Someone had helped him build it, and it had been running, by her best estimate, for at least 2 years before she found it. She found the affair the same way she found everything else, not from a text message or a receipt left in a coat pocket or the kind of accidental discovery that fills the dramatic reconstructions of infidelity stories. She found it in an expense report. Derek submitted business expenses through a shared financial management app that Claire had access to as part of managing the household accounts. There was a restaurant she did not recognize on a Tuesday evening when Derek had told her he had a client dinner on the other side of town. She looked up the restaurant. It was 30 minutes from their house, in the opposite direction of where his client's office was located. She cross-referenced the date with Derek's calendar, which she also had access to. The entry read Team Coordination Dinner. She looked at the charge amount. It was the kind of dinner for 2 that does not get described as team coordination unless the team in question is exactly 2 people who do not work together in any professional capacity. Claire wrote the date, the restaurant name, and the charge amount in her notebook. She closed the app. She went to bed. She did not say anything to Derek that night, or the following morning, or the morning after that. It took her 3 days to decide what to do next. She considered her options with the same structured methodology she brought to every difficult problem, laying out the facts, the possible interpretations, the available responses, and the consequences of each. She could confront Derek directly. She could retain an attorney immediately and begin divorce proceedings. She could leave. She had the personal resources to leave, not as much as she would have had if she had continued working full-time, but enough. She could do all of these things, and she understood that a great many people would have done one or several of them immediately. But Claire Morgan was not built for the immediate response. She was built for the complete one. And the complete response to what she had found required more time, more documentation, and a level of legal and financial specificity that she could not yet provide. She opened a new accordion folder. She labeled it with a date. She started from the beginning. She gave herself as much time as it took. It took 3 years. In those 3 years, Claire Morgan built something that most people would not have had the discipline or the emotional endurance to construct. She continued living in the same house, making the same meals, attending the same social events, sitting across the same dinner table from the same man who was doing the things she was documenting, and she did not break, not once. She did not drop a hint or raise her voice or allow her expression to shift in any way that indicated the distance between the life she was visibly living and the work she was quietly doing in the evenings after Derek went to bed. Pat Simmons, who had known Claire for 22 years by that point and could read her better than almost anyone, knew something was happening from the very early months. Claire told her in the spring of 2020, in the booth of a coffee shop 2 miles from their neighborhood, in a voice so calm and quiet that Pat later said she had to ask Claire to repeat the first part because she had not been prepared for what she was hearing. Claire told her everything. Pat listened without speaking for a very long time. Then she asked one question. She asked Claire what she needed from her. Claire said she needed her to keep the secret until it was time. Pat said for how long? Claire said she did not know yet. Pat said all right, and she kept it. For 3 years, she kept it completely. The documentation Claire assembled across those 3 years was built with the same architectural patience she had brought to her compliance work throughout her career. She did not collect anything carelessly. She did not take risks that could have compromised what she was building by alerting Derek or giving him reason to accelerate or restructure whatever he had already put in place. She worked from information that was legitimately accessible to her as a spouse and a joint account holder, receipts and statements and expense reports and transfer records and tax documents that had passed through the shared financial life of the household. She supplemented this with her own professional knowledge of how asset concealment typically works, the structures people use, the patterns they leave behind, the gaps that appear in records when someone is trying to make a dollar disappear. She had spent her career finding those gaps. She found them again here, and they were not small. By early 2022, Claire had identified 11 separate accounts that Derek had opened without her knowledge. She had traced asset transfers across 4 different holding structures, 2 of which involved shell companies registered through a business associate of Derek's, a man who handled investment structures for several of the firm's senior executives. She had documented income Derek had received through consulting arrangements that had not been disclosed on their joint tax filings. She had assembled a comprehensive record of the affair, not from personal surveillance but from the financial trail it left behind, because affairs cost money, and money leaves records, and Derek Morgan had never once stopped to consider that the woman reviewing his expense reports had spent 15 years professionally trained to find exactly this kind of thing. She had records of transfers to Jessica Cole disguised as consulting fees paid through one of the shell structures. She had records of hotel charges, travel expenses, restaurant bills, all categorized and dated and cross-referenced with Derek's stated whereabouts on each corresponding date. In the fall of 2022, Claire walked into the office of Nathan Cross for the first time. She had researched Nashville divorce attorneys for 3 months before choosing him, reading case outcomes, professional profiles, reviews from clients who had been through high-asset divorce proceedings, and the particular legal reputation Nathan had built over 2 decades for methodical, evidence-driven litigation. She made the appointment under her maiden name. She sat across his desk, placed the accordion folder in front of him, and explained what was inside. Nathan Cross opened the folder. He read through the first section. He turned to the second. He asked Claire 2 clarifying questions about the shell company structures. both of which she answered with specific documentation she pulled from the folder without hesitating. Nathan closed the folder after 40 minutes. He looked at Claire Morgan for a long moment. And then he told her that in 20 years of practice, he had seen a great many things walked through his door, and what she had just placed on his desk was among the most thoroughly prepared personal financial investigations he had ever reviewed. He asked her how long she had been building it. She told him 3 years. He said he would take the case. She said she knew he would. She had already checked his case record. The cancer diagnosis arrived 18 months after that first meeting with Nathan Cross. By March of 2023, Nathan and Claire had been working together steadily through the preparation phase, building the legal strategy around the documentation she had assembled, identifying the strongest elements of the case, anticipating the arguments Derek's future attorneys would make, and structuring their approach with the kind of patience that Claire had learned was the only reliable way to build anything that needed to last. They had not yet filed anything. They had not yet made a move. Claire had one remaining condition before she was willing to initiate proceedings, and that condition was completeness. She wanted the case to be so thoroughly documented, so comprehensively sourced, so legally airtight that no attorney, no financial expert, and no judge could find a meaningful gap in it. She was close. She estimated another 4 to 6 months, and then she went to the doctor for a lump she had noticed 6 weeks earlier, and the 4 to 6 months she had been planning around became something else entirely. She called Nathan Cross from the parking garage of the medical building the afternoon of her diagnosis, before she drove home, before the 11 minutes in the driveway. She told him what the doctor had said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he told her something that she would later say changed the texture of the entire afternoon. He told her that in Tennessee divorce law, a spouse's serious medical condition during divorce proceedings creates specific legal protections and asset considerations that a competent family law judge takes seriously. The diagnosis, Nathan said, did not weaken her position. In the hands of a well-prepared legal team with the documentation she had assembled, it added a layer of protection that she had not previously had access to. Claire wrote that down in her notebook on the passenger seat of her car. She said thank you. She said she would be in touch. And then she drove home and sat in the driveway for 11 minutes and thought about her mother and the green ledger and the Sunday evenings at the kitchen table and the sentence she had never been able to forget. And when the 11 minutes were finished, she went inside and checked the filing cabinet one more time. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. Derek filed on Friday. His attorney had advised him that speed was the strategic advantage in his position. Claire was newly diagnosed, overwhelmed, facing the physical and emotional enormity of cancer treatment, and would be unlikely to have the bandwidth for an aggressive legal engagement. Derek had agreed with this assessment. He had arranged for the papers to be hand-delivered that Friday afternoon, while Claire was at her first oncology consultation at the medical center. She came home to find the envelope on the kitchen counter. She stood at the counter in her coat and read through the filing with the careful attention she brought to every document she had ever reviewed in her life. Then she set it down, she picked up her phone, she opened her text thread with Nathan Cross and typed 4 words. He filed. Your move. She sent it. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to check on the kettle. And the next chapter of everything that was about to happen to Derek Morgan began. Derek Morgan's legal team had built their entire strategy around a set of assumptions, and the first of those assumptions was that Claire Morgan did not know what Derek Morgan had been doing with their money. This assumption was understandable from a certain vantage point. Claire had left professional financial work 8 years earlier. She had been managing a household, raising children, attending school events and neighborhood gatherings, and Derek's firm's annual dinner, presenting to the world the image of a woman whose professional identity had been exchanged for a domestic one. Derek's attorney, a man named Franklin Webb, who had handled a number of high-asset divorces in the Nashville area and who prided himself on reading a situation accurately, looked at the available picture of Claire Morgan and concluded that she was, legally speaking, manageable. He had handled cases involving far more formidable financial opponents. He communicated to Derek that the proceedings would likely resolve within 6 to 9 months. He expected Claire to retain a competent but not exceptional attorney and to focus most of her energy on her treatment rather than her legal situation. He expected a negotiated settlement that would be painful for Derek, but survivable. He was wrong about every single element of that assessment. The first indication that something was not as expected arrived 3 weeks after Derek's filing, when Nathan Cross submitted Claire's initial financial disclosure as required by the discovery process. Franklin Webb received the document on a Thursday morning. He called Derek that afternoon, not with the routine update he typically provided at this stage of a case, but with a specific and pointed request that Derek come to his office in person the following morning. Derek arrived to find the financial disclosure printed and stacked on Franklin's desk. It was 412 pages long. Derek looked at the stack. He looked at Franklin. Franklin told him to sit down. Derek said he did not understand what he was looking at. Franklin told him, as precisely and completely as the situation required, exactly what he was looking at. The color that left Derek Morgan's face in that office on that Friday morning did not fully return for a very long time. What Nathan Cross had submitted on Claire's behalf was not simply a record of the marital assets she was aware of as a spouse. It was a comprehensive financial reconstruction of the Morgan marriage that was more thorough than anything Derek's own accountants had on file. The 11 undisclosed accounts were documented with opening dates, transaction histories, and the transfer chains that connected them to the marital estate. The 4 holding structures, including the 2 shell companies that had been registered through Derek's business associate, were mapped with the precision of someone who understood exactly how these structures were designed to obscure ownership and had simply followed the paper trail until the obscurement ran out. The undisclosed income from consulting arrangements appeared with corresponding tax year references and specific dollar figures. The expense records tied to the affair, the hotel charges and restaurant bills and travel costs, and the transfers to Jessica Cole disguised as consulting fees were presented not as evidence of infidelity, but as evidence of unauthorized disbursement of marital funds. Claire had built the case on financial grounds rather than moral ones, because financial evidence is harder to dispute than personal testimony, and because Claire Morgan had always known exactly which language a courtroom finds most persuasive. Franklin Webb spent 2 full weeks reviewing the disclosure with a forensic accountant he brought in at significant expense. At the end of those 2 weeks, he called Derek into his office again. He told him that the disclosure was not the work of a generalist attorney or a standard divorce legal team. He told him that whoever had prepared Claire's documentation had done so with a level of financial and legal precision that suggested significant preparation time and professional expertise. He asked Derek directly whether he had any reason to believe Claire had been building this kind of record over a period of years. Derek said no. He said it with the particular conviction of a man who genuinely believed that the woman he had been underestimating for the better part of a decade could not have done what was sitting in that stack of paper in front of them. Franklin looked at him for a moment. Then he told Derek that they needed to significantly adjust their approach, their timeline, and their budget expectations for what was now clearly going to be a considerably more complex proceeding than anticipated. Pat Simmons watched all of this from the only vantage point available to her, which was beside her best friend of 22 years. She drove Claire to every chemotherapy appointment across the months of her treatment. She sat in the infusion chairs beside her, and she watched Claire spend those hours, while the drugs moved through the line and into her arm, reviewing legal correspondence, annotating documents, preparing responses to questions Nathan had raised, and building the next stage of something that was already more complete than anything Franklin Webb had imagined possible. The nurses on Claire's treatment floor were startled the first time they saw the accordion folder arrive with her. By the 4th appointment, they had stopped commenting on it. By the 8th, they simply said good morning to it, along with good morning to Claire, which made Pat laugh so hard she had to step into the corridor. Claire allowed herself a small smile and kept reading. The red herring arrived about 6 weeks into the discovery process. Derek's legal team had identified what appeared to be a documentation gap in Claire's record of one of the shell company structures, a 3-month window in the transfer history that did not appear in the materials Nathan had submitted. Franklin Webb communicated this to Derek with a guarded optimism, noting that if the gap represented a genuine hole in Claire's documentation, it could significantly impact the asset valuation argument at the center of the case. Derek's team spent 3 weeks building their counter-argument around it. They submitted their challenge formally during a discovery hearing in early December. Nathan Cross submitted his response the following day. The response was 8 pages long and included 2 exhibits, both of which were documents Claire had collected in the 2nd year of her investigation that covered the 3-month window precisely and completely. The gap had not been a gap at all. It had been a period during which the transfers had been routed through an intermediate account that Claire had traced and documented separately from the main chain. Franklin Webb asked for a brief recess. He stepped into the corridor, called Derek, and told him to sit down before he answered the next question. Derek said he was already sitting. Franklin told him it was going to be a long afternoon. Jessica Cole learned about the full scope of what was happening, not from Derek, but from a paralegal at a firm that handled corporate filings who had seen a court document reference in a professional database and recognized Derek's name from a shared industry connection. Jessica had known about Claire. Derek had told her about the marriage and the plans he had described as already essentially over before he ever filed. What he had not told her, because he had convinced himself there was a version of events in which it did not become relevant, was the scope of what Claire had assembled, or the fact that the transfers made to Jessica Cole across 2 years, disguised as consulting fees through one of the shell structures, had now been formally identified in Claire's disclosure as unauthorized disbursements of marital assets, and had subsequently been included in a referral Nathan Cross had submitted to the Internal Revenue Service. Jessica Cole called Derek the afternoon she found out. The conversation, according to a colleague of hers who overheard it from the next room, was very loud and did not last long. 2 weeks later, she submitted her resignation from the firm. She did not give a reason in writing. She did not need to. The formal mediation session was scheduled for a Tuesday in November of 2023. By this point, Claire was 8 months into her cancer treatment. Her oncologist had described her response as better than projected. Claire had said thank you and asked a clarifying question about the dosage adjustment being considered for the next cycle, which the oncologist later told a colleague was the most Claire Morgan thing that had ever happened in that examination room. She arrived at the mediation session wearing a silk headscarf in a deep burgundy color and a structured blazer she had bought specifically for the occasion, and she carried a cup of coffee and the composure of a person who has already done the most important work and is now simply present to watch it reach its conclusion. Nathan Cross walked in beside her. He carried 2 large binders and a briefcase. He also carried the particular quiet of a man who knows exactly how strong his position is and has no need to announce it. Derek Morgan was already in the conference room when they arrived. Claire had not seen him since he had left for work on the Thursday before the Friday the divorce papers arrived. He looked, in the way that people sometimes look when several months of stress have moved through them without resolution, like a reduced version of the man who had walked into rooms expecting them to arrange themselves around his arrival. His attorney Franklin Webb sat beside him, his expression professionally neutral in the way that professional neutrality is sometimes indistinguishable from profound discomfort. Across the table, Nathan Cross opened his first binder. He said good morning, and then he began. Nathan walked through the documentation in the order Claire had built it, which was chronological and methodical and built like a structure you could walk into and find no exits in. The 11 undisclosed accounts came first, each one presented with its opening date, its transaction history, and its connection to the marital estate. Derek's attorney objected twice during this portion. Both objections were met with documentation that had been anticipated and prepared for, responses that arrived so quickly and so completely that Franklin Webb stopped raising objections and began making notes instead. The holding structures came next, including the 2 shell companies, and the business associate who had helped establish them was named in the documentation with specificity that indicated Claire had known about his involvement for considerably longer than anyone on Derek's side had imagined possible. Derek looked at the table during this section. He did not look up. The transfers to Jessica Cole were presented not as evidence of the affair, but as financial evidence, which was the frame Nathan and Claire had agreed on from the earliest stage of their strategy. The amounts, the dates, the disguised categorization as consulting fees, the paper trail connecting those fees to the shell structure, and the absence of any legitimate consulting arrangement to justify them were laid out in a sequence that required no emotional language and no personal accusation. The numbers said everything. Derek's attorney asked for a 5-minute break at this point. He used those 5 minutes to step into the hallway with Derek and deliver an assessment of the situation that, based on Derek's expression when they returned to the table, was not a comfortable one. The IRS referral arrived in the middle of the afternoon session, not as a new development, but as a fact that Nathan Cross introduced into the record for the first time in a formal setting. He had submitted the referral 6 weeks earlier, as a legal obligation arising from the specific nature of the undisclosed income and the shell company structures identified in Claire's documentation. The referral was not a negotiating tactic. It was not something Nathan had done to create leverage. It was something he and Claire had discussed at length, and that Claire had directed him to pursue because it was the correct thing to do with the information she had assembled, and Claire Morgan had built her entire career on the principle that correct things should be done regardless of their convenience. The referral was now an active IRS matter. It existed independently of the divorce proceedings. It could not be settled in this room or resolved by any agreement reached at this table. Derek's attorney absorbed this information in the same professional silence he had been maintaining for most of the afternoon. Then he asked for a longer break. Derek Morgan looked at Claire once during the afternoon session. It was in the period after the IRS referral had been introduced and before the afternoon break, a moment when the room had gone quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet when everyone present is absorbing something significant. He looked across the table at her. His expression was not the expression of a man calculating his next move. It was something more basic than that. It was the expression of a person who is, for the first time, genuinely seeing the person they are looking at. Claire looked back at him. She did not look away. She did not change her expression. She simply held his gaze with the same steady composure she had brought into that room and into every room for the past 3 years, and before that for the 14 years they had spent married. Then the break was called and she picked up her coffee and turned to Nathan and asked a clarifying question about the asset valuation methodology for the next segment. Nathan answered it. The afternoon continued. The settlement was reached by early evening of that same Tuesday. It gave Claire the house in Nashville, a substantial portion of the marital assets that included several Derek had not realized she had traced to their full value, full spousal support for the duration of her treatment and the recovery period following, and legal fees. Derek retained his employment income and his primary retirement account. Both of those were now subject to liens connected to the IRS matter, which meant they were his in name, but considerably less available in practice than he had counted on them being when he walked into that room in the morning. Franklin Webb shook Nathan's hand at the end of the session with the handshake of a man who has lost professionally and knows it and intends to behave correctly about it anyway. Nathan shook it. Claire put on her coat. She picked up her coffee cup, which was empty. She put it in the trash on the way out of the building. She and Nathan walked to their respective cars in the parking structure, and Nathan told her she had done something extraordinary. Claire said she had done what the situation required. Nathan said those were the same thing. Claire considered that for a moment. Then she said she supposed they were, and she drove herself home. Claire Morgan finished her cancer treatment in the spring of 2024. Her oncologist described her recovery trajectory as excellent and noted, in the careful language of medical professionals who choose their words deliberately, that her patient's unusually stable psychological state throughout treatment had likely been a contributing factor in her physical response. Claire thanked him and asked when she could reasonably expect to return to full professional activity. He said 6 months, conservatively. She said she would aim for 4. She aimed for 4 and hit it in 3.5. Which surprised no one who knew her and would have surprised Derek Morgan if he had still been in any position to be surprised by Claire Morgan. She returned to financial compliance consulting on a part-time basis in the fall of 2024. She had reached out to 2 former colleagues from her Nashville insurance company days who were now running an independent compliance advisory firm, and they had been waiting, they told her, for her to be ready, because the quality of her work was something they had been describing to clients as a benchmark for 15 years. She started with 2 clients. By the end of her first year back, she had 6. She worked from the home office at the end of the hallway, in the room with the filing cabinet. She worked carefully and thoroughly, the way she had always worked, and she was very good at it. And she was, for the first time in a very long time, building something that was entirely and unambiguously her own. Derek Morgan's situation resolved the way financial legal situations of his specific type tend to resolve, which is slowly and incompletely, and in a way that leaves a person technically functional, but significantly diminished. The IRS matter concluded in the summer of 2024 with an agreement requiring the repayment of back taxes, penalties, and interest across 4 filing years. The total figure was significant enough to require the liquidation of 2 investment properties he had believed were protected from the divorce proceedings by virtue of how they had been structured. They were not protected. Claire had known they were not protected. Nathan had explained to the court exactly why they were not protected. The properties were sold. The proceeds went where they needed to go. Derek's contract at the real estate firm was not renewed when it expired in the fall of 2024. He relocated shortly afterward to a mid-sized city in a neighboring state. He did not give interviews. He did not, as far as anyone in the Nashville professional community could determine, fully understand what had happened to him until he was living in the diminished version of his life that what had happened had produced. And by then, the understanding arrived without any audience to receive it. Jessica Cole did not return to the commercial real estate industry. She relocated as well, to a different city, in a different direction from Derek's. She gave one interview in the spring of 2025 to a lifestyle publication that ran a feature on the experience of discovering that a relationship you believed was built on honesty had in fact been built on something that honesty would never have recognized. She did not name Derek Morgan. She did not describe the specifics of the financial arrangements that had connected her to the legal proceedings. She spoke about the experience of being in a situation where someone else's choices about honesty became your problem without your knowledge or consent. It was, several readers noted in the comments section, the most relatable thing in the piece. Pat Simmons spent the year after everything became public doing something she had been unable to do for 3 years, which was talking about it. Not publicly, not in interviews or articles, but in the coffee shops and kitchen tables and front porches where the real conversations between women happen. She told the story of watching Claire build the case in those evening hours while Derek was asleep upstairs, and the way Claire had been so certain from the very beginning of exactly what she was doing and why. She told the story of the coffee shop booth in 2020 when Claire had explained the situation in that quiet, calm voice, and Pat had needed her to repeat the first part. She told the story of driving Claire to chemotherapy with the accordion folder on the back seat. She told these stories because they were true, and because she believed, in the way that people who have witnessed something significant believe, that the story needed to be told out loud by someone who had been there for all of it. Not for Claire's sake, because Claire was busy building her consulting practice and checking her work in the evenings and living in the house with the filing cabinet at the end of the hallway and had no particular need for the story to be told on her behalf. For the sake of anyone else who needed to hear it. The part of this story that does not appear in any court filing, that comes only from Pat's account of a conversation she had with Claire on a Sunday afternoon in the winter of 2024, is about the 11 minutes in the driveway. Pat had asked Claire about them once, directly, in the way that close friends ask the questions they have been carrying for a long time, and finally decide they are allowed to ask. She asked Claire what she had thought about in those 11 minutes, sitting in the car in the driveway on the Monday afternoon, with the cancer diagnosis still warm in her hands. Claire was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had thought about her mother. She had thought about the green ledger, and the Sunday evenings at the kitchen table, and the sentence she had been given as a child, and never let go of. And she had felt, she told Pat, something she had not expected to feel in that moment. She had felt grateful, not for the diagnosis, not for any of the circumstances that had brought her to that driveway on that afternoon, but grateful that she had listened, grateful that she had paid attention all the years when paying attention had seemed like nothing more than a professional reflex. Grateful that when the hardest moment of her life arrived, she had been ready for it, because she had been quietly, patiently, without announcement or recognition, preparing for it for a very long time. And then she had gotten out of the car, gone inside, and checked the filing cabinet one more time, because that was who Claire Morgan was. She always checked her work. This story is not about cancer, though cancer is in it. It is not about divorce, though divorce is in it. It is not even about the money, though the money matters in the specific and serious way that money always matters, when it is the tool someone reaches for to make another person smaller than they are. This story is about what a woman does when she is handed the worst possible version of her life, all at once, and chooses, without drama and without hesitation, to respond with the fullest and most prepared version of herself. Claire Morgan did not get lucky. She did not stumble into the outcome this story ends with. She built it, over 3 years, in a home office, in the evenings, with a notebook and a filing system and the particular professional knowledge that a man who underestimated her had encouraged her to set aside years earlier, and that she had never, Not for a single day, actually set aside. Derek Morgan made a great many decisions in the years this story covers. The most consequential one was not the hidden accounts or the affair or the divorce filing or any of the choices his attorney advised him to make. The most consequential decision he made was the one he made in 2015, when he suggested that Claire step back from her career. Not because the suggestion itself was unusual, or because there was anything inherently wrong with the conversation, but because in making it, he revealed the full depth of his failure to understand who Claire Morgan was. He saw the compliance work and the financial knowledge and the career she had built and the skills she had developed, and he calculated that they could be set aside in service of a household because they were not the larger income and therefore not the more important thing. He was wrong about what was important. He was wrong about what she had set aside. And that error, compounded daily over 8 years, produced the 412-page document that arrived on Franklin Webb's desk 3 weeks after the divorce was filed, and everything that came after it. The question this story leaves behind is not about Derek. It is not about revenge or justice or the specific dollar figures that changed hands in that mediation session. The question this story leaves behind is about you, about the things you have been told to set aside and whether you set them aside all the way or whether some part of you, the steadiest and most competent part, kept them close and kept them ready without ever announcing that it was doing so. About the version of yourself that lives in the quiet hours and does the careful work and checks everything twice, because that version of you is the most important one. It is the one that will be there when the hardest moment arrives. Claire Morgan knew that. Ruth Hargrove had told her so across a kitchen table in Knoxville, Tennessee, when she was 11 years old, and she had never once forgotten it. Tell us in the comments which moment in this story stopped you completely. Was it the 11 minutes in the driveway? Was it the 412-page financial disclosure that arrived on Franklin Webb's desk? Was it the accordion folder on the back seat of Pat's car on the way to chemotherapy? Or was it the sentence Claire's mother gave her that she carried every single day of her life without ever putting it down? We read every comment and we want to hear from you, because the conversations this community has are worth as much as any story we could tell. And if Claire Morgan's story stayed with you, wait until you hear what we have coming next on Untold Deception. A man who mopped the floors of a company he secretly founded, endured 14 months of humiliation from staff who never thought to ask his name, and then walked into the boardroom one morning in a charcoal suit, sat down at the head of his own table, and said good morning. That story is coming. And it is the kind that makes you look at every person you have ever walked past without seeing them and wonder what you missed. Subscribe to Untold Deception so you are here when it drops. New stories every week. Turn on your notifications. The stories that do not make the front page are always the ones worth staying for.